Heads up, the energetics of psilocybin and herbal medicine, remembering and restoring the missing piece in contemporary psychedelic practice, is open soon. You can learn more at the link right here in the show notes. The doors open in March. We begin in March. This is a live 6-week group training program for space holders, guides, explorers, and just psychedelic enthusiasts. If you want to learn the missing pieces that maybe you haven't learned in other training programs around the energetics of psilocybin, the bridge to the human body, other various plant medicines and herbal allies, and learn about Grandma's Witchy Toolkit, which I can guarantee will help you immensely in your space holding and your own personal practice. I am so excited to finally be offering this after dreaming of doing this for years. Sam Perry is a very good friend of mine. He's an absolute genius, and he's very enjoyable to learn from. We've made this program short and accessible and lots of fun, and I hope to see you soon. Just sign up at this link right here to learn more and be notified when the doors open. Robert was sharing some really amazing history in the world of psychedelics, and I thought everybody needs to hear this. So yeah, go on.
Yeah,
Continue
yeah. Well, no, just in the way of introduction, I've had a very long, I'm 68 years old, so my life kind of started when the 60s were going on, born in 1956, and seeing all that excitement going on at the colleges when I was in grammar school and high school, and I was against war, and I was really for the environment. I was a little naturalist, and I loved to fish and be in nature. But then, the 60s movement was very exciting to me as an anti-war movement and a pro-nature movement, and that was very exciting to me. But by the time I got to college, I started college in 1974, that movement kind of faded. And so, college was not really that interesting for me until I became interested in religion. I took up the practice of meditation, which changed my life. I had natural, spontaneous, mystical experiences when I was a kid in nature, oneness and hard to describe stuff. And then when I was taking a course in the history of religion at Columbia, I learned that one of the leading theories for the ancient Vedic Soma sacrifice, the fire sacrifice on which the Rig Veda is based, was a psychedelic mushroom. And my professor, I'll never forget, writing the name R. Gordon Wasson on the board. And for me, it was like, wow, all these years I'd watched my peers and people a little older take drugs, and I didn't think it was very good for them. But now suddenly they were linked with something that I had very deep appreciation for. And so, I left that class and I went to the bookstore and I found a book by Alan Watts and Timothy Leary, and I read it, and it was so interesting to me, and I thought something really has been overlooked in that all that sensational stuff that was going on in the 60s, that these drugs were introduced into the society, but they cause a lot of chaos. And actually, they're very, very important. They're not just trivial. So I wasn't actively seeking this, really, just like as a student. And then I moved to California, and I enrolled in a class with Frank Barron. Now, not a lot of people know Frank Barron, but he's really one of the most important people in the modern psychedelic movement. He was the one that started the Harvard psilocybin project with Timothy Leary. He took the mushrooms before Timothy Leary and recognized something very, very important about them. And so he was my professor, and he was a specialist in the study of creativity and research methodology into kind of altered states of consciousness. And he felt that also that something had been missed when the sensationalism of the 60s eclipsed the value of psychedelic drugs. And so he kind of became my mentor and inspired and encouraged me. I had my first experience there. And we, you said a minute ago when we were talking about the Renaissance and when did the Renaissance start? Well, from my point of view, the Renaissance kind of started in the early 1980s when Frank and I organized a conference at the University of California. That was the first time that a lot of these people came together after the government shut down research, and I was I just graduated and didn't really know very much, but, I was a very thirsty student and read everything. So I quickly read books by, John Lilly and Stan Groff and Timothy Leary. And then all these people came to the conference. And the incredible excitement that, wow, we're going to do this again. We're going to learn from the mistakes of the 60s and 70s, and we're going to start this, psychedelic project again. We called our conference The Future of Consciousness Research. And so, they're just like many years of fantastic meetings with people and being involved in academic stuff. I met Alexander Shulgin back in those days, and we had a nice connection, and I asked him if I had an MDMA experience back then. It was a very secret drug. No one knew about it. It was being kind of handed about in hushed terms by therapists and cool people in Northern California, and I wanted more of it. And so Sasha offered to teach me how to make it. And so I don't have a real aptitude for chemistry or any of that stuff, but I showed up a little while later with a couple of chemistry PhDs, and Sasha told us where to get the materials. And next thing I knew, we had a secret laboratory up at the chemistry department in applied sciences at the Santa Cruz campus. And I had a really nice supply of pharmaceutically pure MDMA that I began to share with people. No one had heard of it. So it's just like a magical time. And then this kind of kept going.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you for sharing. Beautiful, because I grew up outside of Santa Cruz, and I always I make jokes that California is the reason why I took acid at the age 14. It was just so readily available and around. It was very kind of out in the open, and even at that young age.
Did you go to Santa Cruz to get it? What year were you born? Can I ask you?
1975. I did acid when I was when I was 14. Was that 1990? 1991?
Okay, 90. So you were born in 75. Okay.
It was my first year of high school. I don't know. I remember it was a very transformational year. But like you, I had a lot of mystical experiences at a young age. Kind of always was very inquisitive. But, growing up, we'd go to the city, and, back then it was actually Haight Street, and you could just buy anything out in the open on Haight Street. And
Yep.
But I love it because it's, it feels very California, and I miss that by, 15, 20 years. But so let me ask, from that time that you were kind of in the early days of MDMA, and now we're here in 2025 where there was just this very big push and lots of money and lots of hands trying to legalize it for therapeutic use here in the United States. And, we all know the whole story. Well, maybe we don't know the whole story, but it has been, let's say, shut down or maybe temporarily on hold from the FDA approval, which, I personally have some mixed feelings about the whole thing in the first place. But you have some really interesting opinions on, what's happened with MDMA since then. And I would love to hear, because, of course, what I have found is there's a lot of the kind of mainstream narrative is like, we should legalize everything. I don't actually agree with that. I agree with cognitive liberty to be free to practice whatever you want, but to have regulation and a new form of big pharma controlling what I do with my psychedelics is not really my cup of tea. But that's a whole other thing. But yeah, what's going on? You've been following this very closely. You've done some podcast interviews, but what are your views on, like, what went wrong since what year was that? The early 80s? What went wrong from that point until now, or what went right? And what is working with this?
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So this is a very long story with a lot of layers to it. Okay. When I was first involved with MDMA, it was not illegal. It was a magical substance. Everybody and I turned on hundreds, maybe hundreds and hundreds of people from all walks of life. I had this just kind of luck or something, guidance, and I found myself in these situations and was able to meet a lot of different people. So I turned on a lot of celebrities and a lot of scientists and a lot of my friends and professors, and it was like we were part of a mystery school. One of the agreements that I made with Alexander Shulgin was that he would help us get this lab together, but the idea was to keep it low to the ground, under the radar. The DEA did not know about this substance, and so there was no reason to make it illegal. And so that was the deal. And everybody respected this secrecy. In my circle, everybody except one person, and that was Rick Doblin. Rick Doblin got his first MDMA in this kind of quasi-formal underground project that I was doing, where we would offer it to people, sometimes charge just a few bucks. I mean, MDMA is very, very inexpensive to make, a few dollars per gram. I invested like $500. We had the lab already, but I invested like $500 and produced a kilo of MDMA. So that's like 8,000 doses or something. So I wasn't in it for the money. People were asked to just write up their experience and promise to keep it secret. Well, Rick was the only one that didn't do that. Rick, in fact, the opposite of not keeping the secret. Rick, and I don't want this to be a whole show about Rick, but I really do feel like I need to tell this story because the story that gets told in the media about his career fighting to make MDMA legal there's so much bullshit. About 3 weeks ago, I was called by a writer for the New York Times who wrote that recent article and tried to tell him that, the New York Times just covers Doblin like he's some sort of, selfless hero that devoted his life to making MDMA legal. That's so far from the truth. The truth is that he helped it become illegal. Not only did he not keep the secret, he called the media, he called the federal government, he called President Reagan's drug czar, Carlton Turner, and Partnership for a Drug-Free America. This is like at the height of the drug war, right? Or to tell them that there's this not illegal love drug that therapists in Northern California coming out of the Esalen Institute are using. And he sort of called the media to put himself in the newspaper as the Timothy Leary of the 80s to basically make money on it. Because when I met him, he had just somehow evaded prosecution for selling cocaine to college kids in Florida and somehow got out of that. But now he saw this as another opportunity. He's a drug dealer. And put himself in this position, popularized the drug, right at the same time that other people had gotten wind of it. And suddenly it went from being this kind of secret, very special substance that could, open your heart. And it was so, I remember those days so well. It was so special. People having breakthroughs in their relationships or overcoming trauma or just lots and lots of things with no problems. And suddenly it becomes branded as ecstasy, this sensationalistic sort of love drug. And then, all these, the whole rave scene starts where there are,
That's what I was a part of.
Okay, so this is a thing. This is something that makes this a hard conversation to have because there are so many aspects to this. Like, there are a lot. I can tell already that you're one of the really soulful people that recognize the actual value of these drugs. You have a certain maturity and real appreciation for the mystery of all this. But a lot of kids were like lured into this whole rave scene, and what we had begun to appreciate as the really powerful spiritual curative properties of MDMA. I mean, I would tell people to take it in a candlelit room with somebody you love or just small people and have these intimate gatherings. And then when Doblin got hold of it in 83, from 83 to 85, the whole environment changed. And now there are these warehouses on every city all around the country, in the world, actually. This, to me, is, I'll sound like an old person, mind-numbing music, and, random sort of spontaneous sexual encounters. And, okay, so sure, there's a lot of great stuff that can happen in those environments, but I'm just trying to point out how quickly it changed. And, then there's what happens in terms of policy. So the government declares it illegal. I was right in the middle of that, actually. By this time, I had gone on to the University of Chicago, where I was a graduate student in history and psychology of religion, interested in, learning academic models and scientific method to demonstrate the value of these substances. And I brought, by this time, I had several hundred reports of MDMA breakthroughs. And I brought them to the president of the American Psychiatric Association. I brought them to the Harvard Medical School. And so I was involved in the scheduling process. So was Doblin at this point. And the DEA's law judge listened to all of this evidence. The DEA is wanting to make it illegal, claiming that it's a dangerous drug. And yet we've got all these physicians and psychiatrists and other people that are saying, actually, it's extremely valuable. Used in the right way, it can be. Lester Grinspoon from the Harvard Medical School said this could become the most valuable drug in psychiatry. Brother David Steindl-Rast, who had been a Benedictine monk for 35 years, who I took MDMA with, actually with Rick Doblin, said, this drug gives you the same awakened attitude it takes monks a lifetime to acquire. So that the DEA law judge listens to all of this and says it should not be a Schedule I drug. It has a low potential for abuse. It obviously has great medical uses. And so he recommended that it be placed in Schedule III, which would make it available for physicians to make. You could make, a good chemist can make it in their house, cheap. But the Controlled Substance Act of 1970 is written in such a way that the DEA has the power to either accept or reject their own judge's decision. It's basically a martial law. The cops decide, not scientists or philosophers, whether a drug is useful or not. So that's when I began to realize how corrupt this is. And my early work was about, I don't know if you know my books, but my first book is a basically an argument for the reclassification of psychedelic drugs, that they should be given an exemption from the Controlled Substance Act in the same way that peyote is exempt from the Controlled Substance Act because that has religious uses for the Native Americans. Well, all the psychedelic drugs have religious uses for all races, and that they should be completely reclassified, and that the Controlled Substance Act is fraudulent and irrational and non-scientific. And I wasn't able to get any real traction in that approach. So,
wow. Thank you. No, this is amazing history. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, so then, because I had heard you speak about this on a different podcast, and, none of it surprises me. Of course, I haven't heard it before. I never really understood the true history of why it became illegal, especially because it is so harmless, generally, and so has so much potential for therapeutic use. So what would then possess someone, whether it's, Rick Doblin or just his organization, to make it illegal or maybe accidentally make it illegal, but then spend their whole career legalizing it, which is, what he does go around saying is that his whole career was focused on, I want to legalize psychedelics so I can practice as a psychedelic therapist one day. Please don't tell me it's all just driven by money, which, because everything is, it seems like, but what is it that then happened? Because, and not to say it's him, because MAPS was an organization with some key players from the earlier days, but what happened on this journey to then, of course, I think a lot of listeners know about some recent, what went wrong with the FDA trials and, some of the kind of controversy, but yeah, what happened there and why, should it be legal? Do you think it should be legal today? And have we, now it's just too late, or yeah, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I have a lot of thoughts on this, and I have a lot of, one problem with talking to me is that I'm going to cause a lot of listeners to not like me, because I'm going to say things that will cause, we use this phrase a lot, people use this phrase a lot from psychological research, cognitive dissonance. And so I've learned things about modern drug policy in general, and the MDMA scenario in particular, that will get me marginalized. Someone wrote an article about me recently and said, "Oh, Robert Forte has done really good work in the psychedelic field, blah blah blah." But then he went off into, this is the worst thing you can be in modern society, is a conspiracy theorist.
Oh,
yeah. And so my comeback is that, first of all, you got to look at what that word came from and what that means and why people are, but, to my point of view, as a scholar of history and religion and sociology and psychology, is that, if you're not intelligently forming conspiracy theories and then proving them or disproving them with evidence and logic and so on, then you're not ever really going to understand history. And again, so I'm 20 years older than you or so, and I've come to understand that to a very large extent, the entire fabric of American society is a false narrative. Now, I go back to the Kennedy assassination, John Kennedy's assassination, and once you study these things, you realize, of course, that the official story is completely wrong. Not only John Kennedy, but Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King. The official story for the Vietnam War is completely wrong. We know these things now. We know the Pentagon Papers have come out. Even the U.S. Congress said in 1978 that the Kennedy assassination was probably a conspiracy. It's been shown in federal court that Martin Luther King's assassination was not by James Earl Ray, but it was by, there's been 2 books written about this by an Oxford University law professor who did the trial to exonerate James Earl Ray, you know. And so also you learn that the whole structure of U.S. drug policy is a false narrative. It's actually a conspiracy. Drugs, this is very important for people to understand, and why the MAPS thing is completely debased, because it works within that model. It accepts what the federal government says, like, okay, we've got this law, and psychedelic drugs, you have to show they have medical use. The federal government does not make drugs illegal because they want to protect people. It's not about protecting public health. Drugs are illegal because when they're illegal, only criminal conspiracies can engage in the commerce of them. Criminal conspiracies that are aligned with the government, and especially the CIA. So this is not just me saying this, but you know, I will cite studies, or for example, The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia is a very important book started out as a dissertation at Yale University by Alfred McCoy, who then went on to a very esteemed career as a professor at the University of Wisconsin, which shows that the heroin trade and the illegalizing of heroin was a CIA conspiracy that had dual purposes: to keep the population, the blacks in inner cities, suppressed by the addiction and crime and all of that. And plus they would make huge amounts of money to fund their black ops. That's heroin. Cocaine also identified as a CIA conspiracy by an award-winning book by Gary Webb, who was then assassinated, showing that the crack cocaine epidemic was started by the CIA to make a fortune. The Iran-Contra scandal, which was very much in the news during the 1980s when you were just 10 years old. So I have a bit of a kind of handicap to overcome when I try to speak with people your age or younger who, don't really know about this history. They don't really know that, Senator John Kerry, authored a whole report on the CIA's involvement with cocaine and heroin trafficking and the funding of secret wars in the Middle East and also in Latin America. These are huge conspiracies that involve literally billions of dollars in drug sales and weapons sales. Okay, now, the book about how psychedelic drugs are involved in these sort of massive conspiracies really has not been written yet. One very good start is a very important book by a man named John Potash called Drugs as Weapons Against Us. This information is kind of scattered about, like the flooding of psychedelic drugs into the United States in the early 1960s was not an organic development of people like Albert Hoffman and Gordon Wasson and Timothy Leary and Aldous Huxley, but this was a concerted action to deploy psychedelic drugs into the modern world in what I am calling the Brave New World Project. It was an attempt to, the common narrative is that psychedelic drugs came in and people started turning on and became anti-war and anti-government. That's not true. There was already an anti-war movement and a free speech movement and a civil rights movement. The drugs were deployed by the CIA to disrupt this movement, to radicalize this movement. So the anti-war movement went from really smart, organized people, young kids at the best colleges called the Students for a Democratic Society. And they were working on papers and organizing voters and starting to wake people up to the Vietnam War. And then suddenly this group called the Weather Underground gets involved, and it becomes psychedelic, and there's free love. And instead of registering voters, it's like levitating the Pentagon. And it just becomes this kind of trivial movement that alienated it from the mainstream. And so, that's kind of important. And I'm working on a book right now that I'm calling Altered States of America, Psychedelic Movements of the 20th and 21st century. Because I think it's really important that we understand that there may be one group of drugs. We can generally agree on what the psychedelic drugs are. We may have to debate whether ketamine is a psychedelic drug or MDMA or LSD, but generally we think of the psychedelic drugs as these substances that have a long history of use in human societies for religious and healing purposes. They're completely non-toxic. They fit, our brain is designed to receive them. Not quite so easy to make that case with ketamine, which is comparatively toxic. MDMA is comparatively toxic, creations of laboratories. LSD is kind of in between. But one family of drugs, but many different groups of people that use them for completely different reasons. And that's really important to get across, because I think if we're going forward, we need to discriminate between the conscious, therapeutic, evolutionary use of psychedelic drugs, of which there are many uses and applications, and history and evidence, from the, I want to be careful with the words, but, sort of degenerate or, profiteering or mind control aspects of them. So,
well, that's actually what I was going to ask is, so when these substances were brought in and kind of infiltrated these movements that are already happening, was it to then discredit them, or was it for and why would this continue on? Is this for, just another form of, let's see how we can distract society, or maybe we'll get some people who drop out, or maybe it'll mess with people's minds, or maybe it makes them more susceptible to be controlled. I mean, because I see a lot of these medicines as like, oh, well, they have the potential to wake people up, right? To then see the truth and to understand what's really happening on Earth, although, everybody's in disagreement on what's really happening, so we don't even know what the truth is, right? I mean, on some level. Because you ask one person what's really happening in the world, and they'll say one thing, and you ask everyone else, and they'll say something different. But, I see them as like, oh, well, maybe this is helping expand the consciousness and create a better world because of all the potential healing and transformative nature of it. But then, where's the kind of dark side? Where's this conspiracy, other than there's money, like you mentioned, which, by the way, I just started to watch kind of a documentary on this about the cartels down in Colombia and Mexico, and this murder, and it's the government behind it. And of course, I think a lot of people do know about this and believe it, but it's still obviously not the mainstream kind of narrative when it comes to psychedelics. But yeah, why this? Like, why would the government want us to have it, but then make it illegal and then keep it from, I don't, I'm not a huge fan of legalization per se, depending on what it is and what the situation is. But, why not allow human beings to do as they please with our bodies?
Well, I'll keep saying this. It's a very complicated situation, and we have to correct certain misconceptions that are generated by the narrative that's put forth by the engineers of these operations. So one misconception is that, as I said, The government doesn't make drugs illegal because they're interested in protecting the public health. MDMA was not made illegal because the government wanted to protect public health. Cannabis, we now have statements by the architects of Richard Nixon's war on cannabis saying, we knew this wasn't bad. We made it illegal because we wanted to have an opportunity to prosecute these hippies that were anti-war people. That was like their flag, their symbol of the counterculture. Another misconception that we have to correct is that when the government makes the drugs illegal, it doesn't stop it from being used. It actually increases the use. When LSD became illegal in the first, states started to make it illegal in the late and mid 60s. I think California, it was 1966, but the federal Controlled Substance Act was made in 1970. It didn't stop LSD use. It only stopped the scientists and researchers from using it to actually develop its clinical uses. The use in the underground skyrocketed. We were just talking about MDMA, the same thing. When the government made MDMA illegal in 1985, for the next, probably still today, it's the most popular recreational drug in the world. So your question, why would the government make it illegal? As I said, the reason that they make it illegal is so the commerce of these drugs are controlled by criminal conspiracies. It promotes the use. There are actors within the federal government drug policy that are not really allies to American consciousness. They're trying to disrupt the normal development of a healthy society is what they're doing. And this is, again, where I get into problems with people that hear me, because it sounds like such, a crazy conspiracy and such bad news. But when you really look at it, this is what you see. So the psychedelic drugs, it's also complicated because their plan kind of backfired on them in certain ways. And I like to look at a couple of very dramatic examples. One of them is in the case of Timothy Leary, who I knew very well. I did a whole book on Timothy Leary, and I knew him very well for a very long time. As I said, Frank Barron, my mentor for 20 years. Frank and I were very close and would meet regularly. And Tim was originally recruited by the CIA because he was a very charismatic and very brilliant and handsome, articulate Harvard faculty member. And he thought that the CIA thought that he would be a great spokesman for psychedelics. And the CIA funded most of his research at Harvard. And just shortly into that career, in the 1963, Tim came to realize that he was being used by the CIA to promote these drugs, to serve a political agenda that he actually despised. So he broke with the CIA. He loved the drugs. He was a partier, he was a real, just kind of an outrageous, mercurial guy with all these aspects. He loved the drugs. He was committed to the idea of democracy and individual freedom, anti-authoritarianism. And he saw the CIA was a totalitarian enterprise in the United States, and he wanted to pit himself against the CIA. So it wasn't just Tim, pretty much all of the most celebrated characters promoting psychedelic drugs in the 1960s were involved or funded by the CIA. This project at Harvard. There's the psychiatrists that promoted them, and so Tim was the only one that he didn't just encourage people to take psychedelic drugs. He tried to use psychedelic drugs to empower a political movement. He didn't just say, let's, use these substances. He said, question authority and think for yourself, and let's start a new society. The other guys, Ken Kesey, he just wanted everybody to get fucked up. It was a freak show. They would pour acid in the punch, It was a degenerate sort of, constant celebration and of debauchery, really. Tim, there was a real method to his madness, and he became a real threat to this system. And that's why when you look at these characters in the 60s, it was pretty much only Timothy Leary that was prosecuted and hounded, and he had to fight. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison for just a little bit of pot. And Kesey was totally outrageous. Ginsburg, these guys were totally outrageous. The CIA tried a lot of different drug deployment systems to get people high on these substances. Now you ask the question, why?
Yeah, what's the motivation behind it all?
The motivation, and here's where I have to say it's not even a conspiracy. If we want to use that word conspiracy as something secret, because they actually publish their plan. It's not a secret. We look at one of the most important characters in the 1950s, and he died in 1963. Was, of course, Aldous Huxley, great English writer and intellectual. Looking at Huxley's career, Huxley's first book that made him very famous was Brave New World. And when I was a kid, I had to read that in high school. I don't know if where you went, or are you familiar with the book?
Now it's probably banned and burned. No, I'm kidding.
Well, it was actually banned back then because there were very explicit sexual scenarios and all that. But do you know the book, Brave New World?
Yes.
So it's a very important book. It depicts Huxley wrote it in 1938. It depicts the future. And the future is kind of like now, where all the wealth is controlled by a very small number of people at the top of the pyramid. And the masses of people who live in tiny little houses and are basically slaves to the corporate state, they don't ever protest. Why don't they protest? Well, because
they're distracted on TikTok these days.
Well, now it's TikTok, but in Huxley's novel, they were, whenever they got upset about their situation, how come those guys have those big houses and we have to blah, blah, blah. They were ordered to go on what was called a Soma holiday. And they would go away for the weekend, and they were given this drug called Soma, which, this is again 1938, so we didn't even have the word psychedelic, but they were given a drug that would make them feel like everything was okay. Everything was just fine. They would have these quasi-mystical experiences. They would have indiscriminate sexual relations, not form intimate bonds, but just fuck their brains out. That was their treatment. And then they were sort of made docile, and they would then return to society. Okay?
Sounds familiar.
So I ask people to, you don't even have to read Brave New World. You can read a 20-page essay that Huxley wrote 20 years later called Brave New World Revisited. Brave New World Revisited. And it is like the blueprint for what we see today. You just mentioned TikTok. Well, Huxley outlines all of these things that we now see today, and how people are distracted by trivia and drugs and sports. And then another very great book by a social critic, Leo Postman, called Amusing Ourselves to Death, to just distract people with trivia while the political conquest of America, it drives me kind of crazy when I see people alarmed about Trump. Oh no, America's becoming a fascist country. Oh no, we have to do something. Have you been asleep for the last 60 years? America's been a fascist.
It always was. Yeah.
It has been. When the president gets shot in the face in broad daylight and nobody does anything about it, that country, it's a coup d'etat. We've been a kind of, kinder sort of fascist totalitarian country ever since then. And the drugs are, again, the drugs can be awakening, but, I'm not seeing that much of it. The drugs cause, and I think you've talked about this on your program when you speak with clinicians who are using the substances, you have to beware of this. The new phrase is spiritual bypass. Okay?
Take this pill and feel better.
You take the pill and feel better. You have mystical experiences. You're not that, in the spiritual traditions, yoga and Buddhism, the mystical part doesn't come until the later. Like first there is, and I love the sound of this Sanskrit word, and I say it when I do these podcasts, ashrama dharma, which means the truth about the stages of life. It's a teaching in, Upanishads or somewhere, that, you have to first build a house and plant a tree, raise your children, work in the society, develop your discipline, your ethics. Then you get into spiritual practice. Then you develop concentration. The Buddhist Eightfold Path, it's divided up into 3 sections. The first part of it is about really being in the world. This, what I call MK Ultra, which is what promoted the psychedelic drugs. Nowadays, you see a lot of these, you have to ego death. Well, no, actually, you don't want to have ego death. That's who you are. You have to have discipline. We have to enjoy our individuality. You don't want to just bliss out and go into these non-dual states of consciousness and forego the responsibilities of political awareness and, so.
Embodiment.
Yeah.
Earth.
Yeah, like that. So.
I think, this is a really great perspective because, and I think I've talked about this a lot, because I've witnessed it a lot just in our society and psychedelic circles for years. You see people coming back over and over and over, right? And then you see not a lot changing in their life. What are you doing? You're complaining about the same job that you hate, but then you go drink ayahuasca and you go back to the same job, and now it's been 12 years or 15 years, and it's like, well, what do you keep going back for? Oh, because it makes you feel good temporarily. But then you don't take any of what you're learning. You don't actually integrate the changes. And you just said, I think we see this a lot, I guess, in a lot of, these spiritual communities where it's like the up and out, if I can just go into the other realms, then you don't have to live here on Earth, because it's hard. I mean, it's hard to be a human right now. And I think it's like you say, but then that's not the real work. The real work is I always say, here in the 3D, as much as we don't like it, how are you going to bring back, if you learn something from these medicines, or you have even a heart-opening experience from MDMA, it's very interesting. I recently was talking to someone, I've talked to a few people about this, how I say I don't like MDMA. Of course, it feels nice. It's great, but there's this part of me that always feels like Well, it's such a contrived state, right? It's like we take a pill, automatically our inhibitions are down, our heart is open. But then what? It's like if you can't learn from that experience to then, you know, work in a different way in our day to day, like maybe it's showing you something about what it's like to have an open heart as a day to day, in your daily living. But if the only way you can open your heart, by the way, even in relationships, and I don't know, maybe I just don't know because it's never fixed one of my relationships, but is this, if it's like, okay, the only way we can stay married is by doing MDMA once a month, like, I don't know. I mean, is that
Yep.
the solution? I don't think it's bad, but then it's like, well, what about like the earthly practice of like taking what you learn and bringing it in and then being able to hold that? And that's kind of what our, like meditation, other wisdom traditions that take a lot of work and concentration and practice. Yeah, they take longer for a reason, and a pill is great. But and that's kind of where I've been very on the fence with this whole legalization for years, even, since day one. It's like, I believe that humans should be free to do whatever they want, on a certain level, under, like, I guess there's limitations to that. But especially when it comes to working with certain medicines for an intention, like, I came into this to deal with some like really deep family, like ancestral trauma. And it's worked. I mean, it's been extremely helpful. And I have a lot of other practices, meditation, chanting, and studies. But then, it's like, I can see the benefits of these, but then is the solution to, just make them available so widely that people can't even, people just like constantly skip through to the quickest. Like, it's kind of like I've been criticizing this, the mainstream media around microdosing. Oh, just microdose and your depression will go away. And for years I said, well, what's causing the depression in the first place?
That's
Yeah. Yeah.
That's what's so very important.
Like, if our society has anxiety and depression and whatever else is going on, it's like, well, okay, the psilocybin might help or the MDMA might help, but we need to get to the root of the whole problem in the first place. And if there's problems in our society and everybody's upset right now and everybody, no one wants to be on Earth, or no one wants to be in the US, at least it seems like, it's like, well, okay, what are you doing about it?
Yeah.
Other than complaining on TikTok or writing an Instagram post, and this is where it's like, I can't figure out what the right answers are. And hey, I'm not in charge of that anyways, but yeah, what are your views on this? Like, where do we go from here? Like, let's say everybody has, let's say no one calls you a conspiracy theorist anymore, and they all start to believe, like, wow, Robert's right. Like, he's onto something. Then what? Because a lot of times it's like we all feel so helpless in the grand scheme of like who's in charge of making decisions and laws, and it's clearly not the people. So
Yeah.
then what?
Well, what I tried to do is, like I said at the beginning, I would love, in an ideal world, I would love to see the drugs, the psychedelic drugs, reclassified as religious sacraments, and they would be. I think this word legal is tricky. In Santa Cruz, we were able to persuade the city council to kind of decriminalize cannabis. It had to be the lowest priority in the police dossier. You couldn't sell it. So you have to take the money out of it. So people are oriented toward using them because they want to use them for their own spiritual well-being or their own curative practice. They're not being pushed on you. They're secret. You can't promote them. They're they're kind of underground. A society needs an underground. They need to have as soon as they become commodified, then they become pushed. Look at the history of drugs. Look at tobacco. tobacco for, 1,000 years or more, was a sacred substance that was used to, for very specific reasons. But when tobacco becomes a commodity, it's one of the most destructive drugs in the world. Alcohol, the same thing. Wine was, part of sacred ceremonies. But when it becomes pushed by money-hungry people, profiteers, it causes all this terror. And so I'm not really for the legalizing of drugs. I'm for the sacralizing of drugs. I think that our policy towards psychedelic drugs ought to be very much like our policy towards one of the other most sacred things in our human experience, which is lovemaking, right? Like, we all know that that's one of the most sacred, precious things. But you can't force somebody to do it. You can't sell it. That's kind of gross, It's a secret, sacred thing that responsible people evolve to when the time is right. If you're lured into it from the outside, it's not so good as when it comes about as a natural organic process. So I think like that. And there's a great historical tradition behind that. The third book that I published is about the Eleusinian mysteries. So that word mystery, we talk about the mystery religions of antiquity. Mystery comes from a word which means to shut your senses, shut your mouth, be silent. And you can't use your normal, it's not part of the profane, ordinary reality. It's sacred. And in the ancient mysteries, people would gather in ceremony, and they would only do it a couple of times in their life. And it was, in a certain way, the drugs were actually more forbidden, but they were more effective, And in U.S. drug policy, it's all messed up because, like I said, they were made illegal, but on the other side, they were promoting them in the culture. So, these statements of mine are kind of philosophical and idealistic, and I don't really know where we go from here. I'm fascinated by the current scenario because now we've got, you mentioned the MDMA thing. I think that the FDA, I think we should completely rescind the Controlled Substance Act and go back to the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights. That the government, no institution can interfere with an individual's access to the sacred. And in the same way, it's kind of gross and, cheap to sell these things, if that were possible. The FDA made the right decision because that Doblin's application was just fraught with just insincerity and fraud. And, Neshe is a hero in my mind for leading that charge and bringing to the attention of the FDA these numerous instances of sexual violations, scientific violations. And it wasn't, Doblin's trip was never about legalizing MDMA. It was about cornering the market. It wasn't going to be legal for anybody that wasn't part of his organization. If I wanted to do MDMA therapy, I would still be charged with the, Schedule I violation.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And that's where I made a comment, which has since been deleted. Because there was, MAPS posted this article, which, by the way, I've not read because I am not a subscriber and I don't care to be. But I had made a comment about, just questioning MAPS and the agenda. And it was interesting to read all the comments. This was on an Instagram post where, there were a few people just agreeing with what actually happened. Like, we're glad this didn't go through. And then there's a few of us that brought up the money. It's like, well, if it's not in their favor, they seem to be against it. Because this has happened in other instances as well. It's like, well, it doesn't matter what side they're on. They're using the word leftist politics. And I'm like, well, I thought MAPS was actually a somewhat leftist organization. So then that seems kind of contradictory, but it was more about like, well, left, right doesn't really make a difference. But in the end, if it doesn't benefit you and your pockets and your new pharmaceutical company, then it seems to upset you. But, why is it then, the second like a politician is all for this and they give you funding, then you're happy about it. It's like there's I find there's a lot of hypocrisy. Of course,
Tremendous.
that's the world we live in. And it always comes back to money, by the way. That's why I open up this conversation saying, well, let me guess, it's all about the money. Maybe with the government, it's something deeper than that. But I think this is where we're all trying to, and here I am as a business coach, by the way, I help people make money for a living, but we're all trying to navigate what the right thing is and right approach to, these medicines. It's like, how does someone be an underground therapist and charge money for it and still have a living? It's like, the reality is we're here in this capitalistic society and people need money to live. I don't know if we need Lycos being like the next pharmaceutical company controlling all these substances, but isn't that what they're called? I'm like, am I getting their name wrong?
No, that's right. Yep.
But and that's it's like, where do we go from here? Because there's so many nuances, and of course, the way these algorithms work of social media and narratives, and then people with the big voices and big audiences, like we only seem to hear like one side, and it tends to be this like, oh, like let's legalize this, and there's all the nuances are left behind. But when I've worked with clients who've helped with organ and been involved with the organ legalization, and some of the things that go on behind the scenes are like, I'm like, why is no one talking about this? It's like terrible, it's like, and I think I'm like, well, I really believe, on some level, especially when we're dealing with plants and plant spirits, the plants know best and they'll take care of things. And if it's not going to work, it won't work. But I don't know. It's such a nuanced area. Yeah.
Yeah, it's complicated, and there are layers to it. I happen to think, and again, from the standpoint of my life, before, like in the 1980s, there were a lot of people that were using psychedelics in their practice as therapists. It wasn't a big deal. It had to be secret because they were illegal, and there weren't problems. People were drawn to it because, there's an intelligence of nature, and you recognize that this is a valuable thing, and you do it from your heart. You don't do it because you need to pay your rent. You don't have this conflict of interests. And I trust something like that can happen, but we have to understand that there is a active agenda underway to push these drugs onto society. You mentioned microdosing. That's a subject that's something else that I think I sent you that little piece I wrote. I may write more, but to me that's totally fascinating, like how that happened. Like this whole microdosing thing really happened because of a conversation that I had with Jim Fadiman, who was a good friend of mine. We would meet for lunch when he was writing his book, and before 2000, microdosing was something everybody in the underground knew. We would say, okay, we're going to microdose. We're just going to take 10 or 20 mics, and we're going to go for a hike or whatever. And sometimes I would prescribe it, take it every day for a while, and kind of gradually chip away. But it was kind of secret and sort of cool and not that big a deal. I told Jim Fadiman about it, and he put it in his books, and really, like overnight, suddenly it's in the media, CNN, Fox News, The Economist, microdosing. If you Googled the word microdose before 2011, it wouldn't even show up on Google. No. Now you Google it's like everywhere. It's promoted. It's advertising psychedelic drugs as, what I'm saying, a kind of Huxleyan soma. Just distract yourself. Take this, like scramble your consciousness so you're not really aware that, half your taxes are going to fund these criminal wars, or, how messed up things are. And, you know, I like doing these podcasts, but I think it would be interesting. Like I was watching one of yours earlier today with that guy, Alexander Biener.
Oh, Biner, yeah.
You know, and he started a thing called Rebel Wisdom, you know, which just, you know, tried to say like conspiracy theorists and, you know, like I would love to have an opportunity to discuss this kind of stuff with people, like, and have a little back and forth. And the art of dialogue has been, you know, kind of lost in our contemporary society. Instead, we have these, you know, we have people pushing a narrative, and then fortunately a growing number of people that are starting to question them. And I don't have an answer, but you know.
Well, it's funny because, you know, you mentioned microdosing, and I'm of the view that like, oh, okay, maybe if more people are turned on to these medicines, maybe that will wake them up to question more things, to maybe question like, even, by the way, this is the first thing I said when Trump got elected and everybody's freaking out, is like, why is everybody giving so much power to this one person or a handful of people? You know, like, where is this? What went wrong where everybody's, you know, just constantly pointing towards the external, like, this is my problem, this is what's wrong in the world. And it's like, well, what if everybody started turning inward? You know, and that's what my prayer is, where, okay, maybe if they're working with medicines, they will start going inward, because eventually you can't ignore what's actually happening inside, or at least that's what I would hope. I don't know. Meaning like, oh, if I want to change something in the world that I don't like, maybe I should start with whatever's in myself. Or, you know, I've written about like, okay, you don't want wars. Well, where are you fighting a war within yourself? You know, it always starts with each and every individual. Or where's the war with pointing fingers at, you know, the other? And I think Eisenstein says this a lot, like othering. Like there's this constant here in the US of othering and like pointing, and, you know, and yeah, people can't even have calm dialogues, or I shouldn't say people, but a lot of people. You know, and it's like, that's what my hope is like, well, you know, maybe these psychedelics are going to help us have a little more love and compassion, or I don't know, maybe it is a distraction. I mean, I've come to both conclusions. I've actually gone very deep into questioning like the level of like just how busy our culture is, you know, and then you throw in the distractions, whether it's drugs or alcohol or shopping or, you know, social media or the internet or blogs, or, you know, I could go on and on. Netflix, and now there's every version of Netflix. And so there's so much distraction. But then, I don't know, I'm like, well, maybe if someone's going to an ayahuasca ceremony instead of getting drunk and sitting in front of Netflix, like maybe they will start to question things. Maybe they will start to be the change. I don't know. Maybe that's just me and all my friends, but well, maybe I'm living in that bubble. But
I think it depends entirely on. We know this about psychedelic drugs, that it's about set and setting, and so why I'm calling my book The Psychedelic Movements, because there are a great many people that do use the substances in just the way that you're saying. They want to use them in secret. They want to use them to empower themselves. Then there's another group of people that's using them to empower the institutions. Like where is the locus of authority here? Is it within the person to question authority? This is the kind of really traditionally American perspective. Like we in the democratic perspective, that the kingdom of God, so to speak, is within us. We don't want to project that onto the authority, like looking for permission from the federal government to do this kind of work. We have to understand that the institutions are really corrupt, whether it's Imperial College or Harvard or, you know, these great universities are designed to conserve the worldview of contemporary society, which is kind of fascist, really. It's not really a democratic society for the welfare of all. It's been progressively concentrating the wealth and power among fewer and fewer people. It is consuming the Earth's resources, to advance this apparatus. But then there are people that use them to get, Tim's phrase, to turn on, tune in, and drop out of that false, socially constructed world and create our own realities, our own communities, our permaculture, and not participate in this corrupt world. And so the psychedelic drugs can advance that. And so that's why, I think we just really need to discriminate. And I'm pleased, as I watched this thing with MAPS over, that began last summer, that there are a lot of people that realize, something really fishy about that setup. He wasn't really making them legal. He was making a monopoly for himself.
Yeah.
Right?
That's when I started to actually, I think it was a few years ago when Lycos came out, and I was like, oh, wait, because I remember I interviewed him and he mentioned starting his own pharmaceutical company, and I was like, that's immediately it was a red flag.
Yep.
And I do honor them for a certain level of, the work they've done, and there's a lot of questions. And I think it's interesting, I encourage people, I don't know what's going on that Instagram post, because I was actually just I decided to take down my comment because, I don't know if it was helping anything, and it was just people started fighting with each other about something unrelated. And I was like, you know what? I don't even want my name tied to this right now. But it's interesting to learn and see, not everybody is on the same page. And it is good to really do the deeper research beyond just, here's the thing, the world we live in is people are learning about psychedelics from an Instagram post. It's people are getting their news and their information in 30-second tidbits, and then they take it to believe oh, this is everything. We should legalize this because this one post says how great it is. But then, there's so many deeper layers. It's the follow the money. Every time you follow the money, you start to unravel, oh, well, maybe it's not what I thought it was, or maybe it's, why? And this is where there was a lot of argument in Colorado for the legalization, where it's where indigenous practices and, legal plant medicines that are traditionally used, where are they in all this? And now if we legalize it, it's actually going to be more of a hindrance and an issue for them. And it's so how do we get this right? And I, as someone who's been working in this, in the kind of the longer short term, I've said things are moving so fast, or things were moving so fast. I'm actually glad that there was something that was halted, because it's if everybody just keeps approving everything and legalizing everything, it's without thinking a lot of it through and looking at all the layers. It's well, maybe it's not the best idea. Maybe we're going to end up in yet another, maybe it'll be cigarettes and alcohol,
Yeah, I think we have to be mindful of that. For my own purposes, I just, I've never been a cultist. I urge people to stay away from cults. I advocate individual responsibility, to trust yourself. I find more and more people using these substances wisely, kind of just turning off all that stuff, not going for the hype. They're recognizing it. And I think that there is innate intelligence to our to the spiritual path and to our ability to resonate with wisdom, that the more we speak the truth, the more people can see it. And
well, that's what I'm hoping. Yeah.
It's a very, special. I don't even live in the United States anymore.
I was going to say, you're one of the people that actually doesn't live here anymore, that, all these people are threatening to leave and no one's actually leaving.
Yeah. No, I left. I got very lucky. I came here to, in Greece. I live in Greece, and I've been living here a little bit more than a year. I met an amazing person. I was invited to give a talk at a conference on ancient mysteries and the book, The Road to Eleusis. And I just kind of connected with a very special being, and she welcomed me into her country. So now we're married and we live in this beautiful place, and it's a whole different vibration and political consciousness here. And, Greece is just really fascinating to me. So I get to be reborn. But when I went back to the States for a couple of months this past fall, and, the animosity between the different political parties and the economic anxieties are really very tangible. And, I've had visions on, I had a whole period where I got deeply into ayahuasca in the late 1990s and early 2000s, where I was interested in the healing properties of ayahuasca. Not so much the mystical properties, but I was interested in how a friend of mine was cured of a very deadly cancer. And so I embarked on a little field research, and I would take cancer patients down to Peru to be treated by its traditional curanderos down there. But as I saw this whole popularizing of ayahuasca and the profaning of it, that it really broke my heart. So I wanted to just leave those people alone and began to come back and work with cannabis. Because this is my own position, is that I love the power and the mystery of what psychedelics do. And I so deeply abhor the commodifying and exploiting of them for selfish and political agendas that I still feel like I want to speak out. But, and I'm delighted to make this connection with you, because it reminds me that there are so many people that do see the deeper potential of these substances, and we just have to swim away from all that shit.
And pray a lot, as I say. I'm like, I just pray a lot that, there's something higher at work, and there's, I really believe in okay, there's more and more people kind of on a similar path looking, I was just I was in a random place in Mexico, and I walked by on the beach one day, and there was this couple out there just on the ocean in the middle of broad daylight doing a peyote song and on a makeshift water drum. And I was like, I have to remember that there's people praying all over. There's people that are really walking the path and wanting the best for the planet, and not I really do believe, like you've mentioned, this intelligence. There's a higher intelligence. There's something that's way beyond our conception, that we don't know. And this is why, yes, I consider myself someone who cares about what's happening on Earth. And I also, I don't know if it's going to come through fighting one another. It's like yelling at your neighbor because they're on the other side is not really going to solve the world's problems. I mean, it's human nature. There's 8 billion people. And I don't believe that othering is going to help, because now 50% of the U.S. population is just going to suddenly change their mind. I don't know. I mean, I don't think that's the way. I don't think that's the path forward. I think all it does is perpetuates war. It's like the consciousness, which is the approach I take, is from the larger picture of the energetics and the consciousness even behind that, behind calling someone a name or yelling at the person with the Trump bumper sticker. It's like, what is that even doing for the larger energetics at play here?
Right.
It must be interesting to not be in the U.S., because I hear this from all my friends, my friends in other countries. It's like, it's just, it's not all what it's feeling here. And it's like, well, it's interesting how much of, I think the U.S. is manifesting all, everybody keeps talking about everything going to shit and everything crumbling and falling apart. I'm like, well, we're just creating it every day.
These are a lot of very deep and really complicated issues, and I just have to go back again to individual responsibility and local reality, so that you're emanating vibrations and resonating with those vibrations in others. I asked a wise person once about these issues in the early days with in the anti-war movement, and they said, "Oh, world peace? That's easy. Everybody stop fighting." Like that. I know eradicate from yourself these poisons of greed and hatred, clarify your consciousness, be sure of your motivations and come from your heart. And back to MDMA, that's what it was like in those early days. Like we felt that this was a godsend, an evolution of, universal intelligence to open up our hearts. And those of us that were experimenting with this substance, we also thought at the time, it was just kind of heartbreaking in a way that you didn't want to use it very often. When you took MDMA, it was, in these early days, it was like, wow. And it gave you, it like activated, your heart. And if you used it frequently, you knew like, oh, I'm leaning on this.
Yeah.
And I would tell people that you only get like 5 or 6 really good experiences. And it was really amazing and sad to see what happened when it got in the hands of people that were interested in selling it, and making money from it. And it just contaminated the whole vibe. So if we can go back to the recognition that these are sacred, and, that word sacred is not trivial. That word sacred comes from a word that means separate from ordinary reality, from the ordinary world of commerce and acquisition. And, it's about letting go. It's not about reaching and taking kind of thing.
Wow. Thank you for sharing. Well, before we go, because I do have to wrap up in a few minutes, but I wanted to hear, you were just about to share about an ayahuasca vision or two, and I would love to hear a little bit more about that, and then hear a little bit more about, this book and when it's coming out, and
well,
we need it.
I started to work on the book a few years ago, and then, in Northern California, there were fires. And so I was a fire victim where I had just taken, I was very involved in this subject for many years, and I had correspondences with all of these people, Wasson, I knew them all, Wasson, Hoffman, Shulgin, Groff, Leary, Claudia Naranjo was I had all this correspondence and letters and memories, and I had just gathered all those things in one place in my little house in the Santa Cruz Mountains, and began to handwrite my book and just let it all come out and flow out of me. And it was starting to do that. And then these fires came out of nowhere. I won't get into the conspiracy theories behind the origin of these fires, but one day it was a beautiful day, and I felt blessed to be in this magnificent spot up in the Santa Cruz Mountains and the redwoods. And the next day, these fire, and then pretty soon it was just like gone. It's like a Buddhist teaching story. So my entire library of books that I'd been cultivating and read and correspondence with all of these people that was going to be my book just gone. And I had absolutely nothing but, my couple of rugs. So it's taken me a couple of years to regroup, and I've been a nomad. I finally have my own place, and I'm married and really grounded. So I'm really devoting myself to finishing this book and another screenplay that I have interest in about Leary's. The ayahuasca vision that I was going to say, not just ayahuasca, and maybe these visions were sort of precipitated by the teachers that I studied with. Stan Groff being a very important one, another Mircea Eliade, a religious historian at the University of Chicago. These guys were eschatologists. Eschatology is the study of the end of the world. Okay, so not very cheerful, but in a way it's very liberating to look at the eschatology in the various world religions and maybe get a sense, in my case, a very, kind of, look, we're all going to die. We all know that you're going to die. I'm going to die. My son's going to die. Our parents are going to, everybody dies. We can more or less get a handle on that. It's a little bit trickier to realize that species die. There's a lot of, so we go through a death and rebirth of our individual selves. We may be nearing the end of time. My professor Eliade was pretty sure about that. A lot of, in the Eastern traditions, we talk about the Kali Yuga, the age of great deception. And it seems like that's where we are. Like every age has this sense like, oh no, this is going to be the end. But we human beings in this so-called advanced state actually have the means to bring that about. I mean, there's so much corruption. It could end. We could be, like this. And I've seen that in visions that we're going to see this increasing, what we're seeing now in America, like just kind of madness and confusion, and that seems horrible, but it's actually a great opportunity to really develop ourselves spiritually, because we don't ever really die. Once we kind of refine our consciousness, we can transcend this death in this scenario. And it's a very, very big universe. And so it's like a womb. When a fetus is in the womb, about to be born, the fetus has the experience like, oh, fuck, this is the end of this. This is like a perfect setup I have here. It's like the temperature's just right. I got all this food. But suddenly it becomes too crowded and it becomes a toxic environment, and this thing happens. And it's almost impossible for the fetus to stay calm, because they can't imagine that there's another life form outside of the womb. But my sense, my confidence, I'm not afraid of this anymore. I sort of welcome it. I just want to be as good a person as I can be, and as honest as I can be, and as intelligent as I can be, and as courageous, and embodying these qualities of the human spirit. And then we're immortal, basically.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, I interviewed Daniel Giamario about the Kali Yuga, and he has interviewed, I forgot the name of the writer, but a guy an Indian author who wrote a book on the Kali Yuga, and one of the theories is that it officially ends, which, 26,000 years, like next month. And I'm like, oh, well, I like that theory. We still have 26,000 years to kind of see it take form, but I don't know. I kind of I have had similar visions. I sometimes wonder, like, well, how much of this is quote real versus the constructs of my programming or my mind, and also how much of it is actually in our like deep in our DNA, like as a human race, right? Like as the humans, not white person living in America, but like the human race. And I think on some level, it's in the consciousness. Like we know that something is not working right now, and there's a grand imbalance, and maybe it will, like everything in nature, it does come to a place of equilibrium, right? Everything eventually sorts itself out somehow, and it's beyond control of people pointing fingers on Instagram, so.
Yeah, that's why it's really interesting for me to live in Greece now, because just, a mile or so down there on the beach is, they're ancient ruins, of that were built 800 BC. And, there's another one up down there, the temple, because we have the temple of Artemis right over here, and there's the Poseidon temple there, and there's Delphi that's just a couple of hours over there, so you can see this. There was, and then they're even older. If you go out to Crete and the Minoans, it goes back into 3000 BC. And so we can see the ruins of great civilizations, and we're not exempt from that. Our empire, the American empire, is probably going to, come apart. And then on top of that, right now, as we speak, just out in the Aegean Sea, just, a few hours that way, that's where the legendary Atlantis was, probably. And it was blown to smithereens by an enormous volcano, 1600 BC. Well, right exactly where that volcano was on the island of Santorini for the past 2 or 3 weeks, there have been hundreds of earthquakes ongoing. They've evacuated the island. And so ever since my ayahuasca and mushroom visions in the 80s and 90s, I'm like, I wake up every morning and think, okay, this could be that. Let's really savor this moment and bring to life the very best qualities of our humanity, because it might be our last chance to do it.
Well, Robert, this has been a really beautiful conversation. I'm so glad you came on. And when do you expect, to maybe do some podcast interviews promoting your new book? When is it maybe going to come out?
Well, I think I've got a year before I'm really finished with it. I don't know how long it's going to take. I'm starting to do more podcasts because I want to get it flowing. Like when we get off, I've had some thoughts that I want to jot down.
Great.
One of my favorite writers, a dear friend, author of what I think is one of the most useful books on psychedelic history. If you haven't already read Storming Heaven, which came out in the late 1980s, was a very important book for me to get going. He's like a big brother to me, and he's coming out. We're going to commit to 2 months of really good work. So maybe by the end of the summer,
Great.
I'll have more.
Great. Can't wait. Yeah, this will be interesting. And please be in touch and, come back on when it's ready to come out, and we'll promote it. And hopefully,
Sure.
Who knows how the world will change by then. So
Yeah, I love the work that you're doing. Thanks for reaching out. I'm looking forward to another conversation with you, and I hope your listeners enjoyed this wrap.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.